Right now, two of the most powerful nations on Earth are locked in a standoff over a strip of water 21 miles wide. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow channel between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. The United States has naval assets positioned. Iran has threatened to close it. Both sides are speaking in ultimatums. Both sides are watching the other for any signal of weakness. Both sides are convinced that the first one to ease the pressure loses. And here is what nobody in the news coverage is saying. This is not a geopolitics story. You have lived this story. Not with warships and oil tankers, but in your kitchen, your office, your inbox, your closest relationships. The same psychological forces driving two nuclear-adjacent powers to the edge of a catastrophic miscalculation are the same forces that turned your last serious argument into something neither of you intended. The mechanisms are identical. The stakes are different. The psychology is the same. Escalation does not happen because people are irrational. It happens because people are human, because the brain under threat follows a completely predictable sequence of steps. Steps that make perfect sense from the inside and look like pure madness from the outside. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why conflicts escalate when nobody actually wants them to, what keeps both sides locked in a pattern that is destroying them, and, most importantly, the precise psychological move that breaks the cycle without requiring you to lose. Because here is the question the whole world is asking about the Strait of Hormuz right now, and the question you have quietly asked yourself after every significant conflict in your own life. Who should back down first? The answer is going to surprise you. Chapter 1. The Threat Ladder. Every escalating conflict follows the same architecture. It does not matter whether it's two superpowers or two people who used to love each other. The structure is identical, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Psychologists call it the escalation ladder, a predictable, sequential climb from low-level tension to full conflict, where each rung feels not just possible, but necessary. Here is the reframe. Escalation is not a loss of control. It's a series of perfectly rational individual decisions that collectively produce an irrational outcome. Each step on the ladder feels justified in the moment. Each party believes they're only responding to what the other side just did. Neither party believes they are escalating. They believe they are responding. And that gap between how escalation feels from the inside and what it looks like from the outside is where conflicts go to become catastrophes. Iran restricts shipping movement in the Strait. The U.S. responds with an increased naval presence. Iran interprets the naval presence as aggression and issues a threat to close it entirely. The U.S. interprets the closure threat as a red line and positions strike assets. Each step feels like a response. The latter only becomes visible when you zoom out and see the whole structure. Your partner makes a cutting remark. You respond with a colder tone. They escalate to a raised voice. You escalate to bringing up something from 3 years ago. They escalate to questioning the entire relationship. You escalate to sleeping in another room. You both went to bed having a conflict neither of you wanted, and neither of you technically started. Each rung felt justified as a response. The ladder was never visible while you were climbing it. When tension begins to rise, ask yourself, am I responding to what is actually happening, or am I adding a rung to a ladder we're both going to regret climbing? Think about your last significant conflict. At what point did it stop being about the original issue, and when did the ladder become more important than what started it? Chapter 2. The Honor Trap. Here's the psychological mechanism that keeps every escalating conflict alive long after both parties would rationally prefer it to end. It's not anger, it's not hatred, it's not even genuine disagreement about the underlying issue. It's the terror of being seen to lose. Social psychologists call this face threat, the deep human drive to protect one's public image, status, and reputation from perceived damage. In every escalating conflict, there comes a point where the original issue becomes secondary to the question of who blinks first. The conflict is no longer about the strait, or the remark, or the email. It's about identity. It's about what backing down would say about who you are. Iran's leadership cannot be seen by their domestic audience and regional allies as capitulating to American pressure. The U.S. administration cannot be seen by its allies and domestic base as backing down from a direct challenge. Both positions make complete rational sense within their own frame, and both positions guarantee that the conflict continues regardless of whether either party actually wants it. You've been in a cold argument with someone for 2 days. The original cause was minor, something that could have been resolved in 10 minutes. But now so much has been said, so many lines have been drawn, so much face has been invested in the position that backing down feels like admitting you were wrong about everything. So the silence continues, and each day of silence adds another layer of face investment that makes resolution even more costly. The honor trap springs when we conflate our position with our identity, when being wrong about the argument starts to feel like being wrong about who we are. When you feel the honor trap closing, ask yourself, am I continuing this conflict because it still matters, or because I'm afraid of what resolving it would say about me? What is the conflict in your life right now that has long since stopped being about the original issue and now is entirely about who backs down first? Chapter 3. The Fundamental Attribution Abyss. Here's something that will reframe every conflict you've ever been in and every conflict you will ever watch unfold between nations. Both sides in every escalating conflict believe exactly the same thing about each other. They believe the other side is acting from aggression, bad faith, and a fundamental desire to dominate. And they believe their own side is acting from legitimate defense, reasonable self-protection, and necessary response to genuine threat. Both sides hold this belief simultaneously. Both sides are wrong about the other. Both sides are right about themselves. This is the fundamental attribution error, the universal human tendency to attribute our own behavior to circumstances while attributing other people's behavior to character. When I escalate, it's because they forced me to. When they escalate, it's because they are aggressive, irrational, and dangerous. This error applied at the geopolitical level is genuinely catastrophic. The U.S. frames Iran's actions as aggression, driven by a hostile regime's expansionist ideology. Iran frames U.S. actions as aggression, driven by imperial hegemony and historical interference. Neither frame is entirely fabricated. Both frames are entirely incomplete. And as long as each side is only operating from their own frame, the conflict cannot de-escalate, because de-escalation requires being able to see the situation through the other side's eyes, and the fundamental attribution error makes that almost neurologically impossible under threat conditions. Your colleague responds to your email curtly. You immediately conclude they have an attitude problem, are passive-aggressive, and have never respected you. What you don't know is that they received devastating personal news an hour before your email arrived, and their curt reply had nothing to do with you whatsoever. You escalate. They are confused. The conflict compounds. When you feel certain about your interpretation of another person's behavior, pause and ask, what would this exact behavior look like if they were acting from fear or pain rather than malice? Think about a conflict where you were absolutely certain about the other person's motivations. How much of that certainty was evidence, and how much was your brain filling in the gaps with the worst possible explanation? Chapter 4. The Miscalculation Window. Every major conflict in human history has contained a moment that historians later identify as the point where everything could have gone differently. A decision made on incomplete information, a signal misread, a gesture intended as conciliatory that was received as provocative. Psychologists and military strategists call this the miscalculation window, the period of maximum danger in any escalating conflict where the gap between intention and perception is at its widest. The Strait of Hormuz situation is currently inside a miscalculation window. When both sides are at elevated alert, operating under domestic political pressure, reading every move through a threat-activated nervous system, the probability of a genuine accident being interpreted as an intentional act of aggression rises dramatically. History is full of conflicts that nobody wanted and everybody stumbled into because one miscalculation triggered a response that triggered a response that triggered a point of no return. The miscalculation window exists in personal conflicts too. It is the period in a heated argument when your nervous system is fully activated, your threat detection is at maximum sensitivity, and your capacity for accurate interpretation of the other person's words, tone, and intent is at its lowest. This is the window in which you hear contempt in a neutral tone, see rejection in a distracted glance, and interpret a pause as a deliberate power move. You are operating on the worst possible information at the moment when the stakes are highest. Your partner says fine at the end of a tense exchange. Your threat-activated brain immediately reads it as hostile, dismissive, and loaded with subtext. You respond to the subtext you imagined rather than the word they said. The miscalculation compounds. The argument restarts from a new and more dangerous position. When the temperature is high, give yourself one instruction. I am currently inside a miscalculation window. I will not make any irreversible moves until I can think clearly again. Think about a conflict that got significantly worse because of something said or done in the heat of the moment. What was the miscalculation, and what would have changed if you had identified the window before acting inside it? Chapter 5. The Symmetry Illusion. Both sides in every escalating conflict believe the conflict is asymmetric in their favor. Both sides believe they are the reasonable party dealing with an unreasonable opponent. Both sides believe they have shown more restraint than the other side. Both sides believe the record of events, if examined objectively, would vindicate their position entirely. They cannot both be right, but they both feel right with complete conviction. This is what psychologists call the symmetry illusion, the near-universal human inability to accurately assess our own contribution to a conflict we're inside. We have perfect access to our own intentions. We know we did not mean it that way. We know we were provoked. We know we tried to de-escalate at that one point last Tuesday. We have zero access to the other person's intentions and imperfect access to their experience of events. So our accounting of the conflict is always skewed, not from dishonesty, but from the structural information asymmetry of being a participant rather than an observer. Every U.S. administration believes it has shown remarkable restraint in face of Iranian provocation. Every Iranian government believes the same about American provocation. Both have carefully curated internal narratives that are logically coherent and factually selective. This is not propaganda, or not only propaganda. It is the symmetry illusion operating at national scale. You and a close friend have a falling out. Your account of the conflict, told to a mutual friend, is a story of your patience, your attempts to communicate, and their unreasonable responses. Their account, told to the same mutual friend, is an almost unrecognizable version of events, featuring your coldness, your escalations, and their reasonable responses. Same conflict, two internally consistent and mutually incompatible narratives. The most destabilizing question you can ask yourself in any conflict is this: if someone I respected had watched this entire conflict from the beginning with no loyalty to either side, what would they say I contributed to it? How different is your account of your most significant ongoing conflict from what an objective observer would likely conclude? And what is the gap between those two versions telling you?
Chapter 6: The De-escalation Paradox. Here is the answer to the question this video opened with. And it is the answer that makes everyone uncomfortable regardless of which side of any conflict they are on. The person who should back down first is the one who understands that going first is not losing, it is leading. De-escalation feels like surrender because we have been taught to read conflict through a zero-sum lens. If you back down, you lose. If they back down, they lose, and whoever holds their position longest wins. But this framework only holds if the goal is to win the conflict. The moment you ask what the actual goal is, a stable strait, a repaired relationship, a functional working environment, the zero-sum frame collapses entirely. Research on conflict resolution consistently shows that unilateral de-escalatory gestures, one party taking a conciliatory step without precondition, are significantly more effective at breaking escalation cycles than negotiated simultaneous concessions. Not because they are morally superior, because they are strategically superior. A unilateral de-escalatory move forces the other party to either reciprocate, which breaks the cycle, or escalate against a visibly conciliatory opponent, which shifts the moral and strategic position dramatically in the de-escalator's favor. This is the de-escalation paradox. The move that feels like weakness is often the most powerful move on the board. Diplomats have a name for this strategy: GRIT, Graduated Reciprocation in Tension Reduction. Small, unilateral conciliatory gestures, made publicly and without precondition, that invite reciprocation without demanding it. It worked between Kennedy and Khrushchev in 1963, when the world was closer to nuclear war than at any point before or since. It works in marriages. It works in offices. It works between nations. You have been in a cold conflict with a colleague for 2 weeks. Rather than waiting for them to apologize first, you send a single, genuine message. I think this has gone on longer than it needed to. I would rather work well with you than be right about this. You have not admitted fault. You have not capitulated. You have made a unilateral de-escalatory move that forces a choice. When you are locked in a cycle, ask yourself, what is the smallest, genuine conciliatory move I could make right now that costs me little but could change everything? Who in your life are you currently in a cold conflict with, where a small, unilateral gesture from you, not because you were wrong, but because you value the relationship more than the position, could break a cycle that neither of you is winning? Chapter 7: The Nervous System at War. Every conflict,
from the Strait of Hormuz to the silent treatment across a dinner table, is ultimately a conflict between nervous systems before it is a conflict between people or nations. When the threat response activates, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of nuanced thinking, long-term planning, and empathy, goes partially offline. The amygdala takes over. And the amygdala has exactly one question that it applies to every stimulus it receives in a threat state: safe or dangerous? That is it. The rich complexity of the other person's humanity, history, and intention compresses into a binary, and from that binary, responses are generated that the prefrontal cortex, if it were online, would recognize as disproportionate, counterproductive, and likely to make things significantly worse. Neuroscientist Daniel Siegel calls this flipping your lid, the moment when the prefrontal cortex loses its governing relationship with the emotional brain, and the response that emerges is raw, reactive, and almost entirely disconnected from what the situation actually requires. You have watched world leaders flip their lid in press conferences. You have watched yourself flip your lid in arguments. The mechanism is identical. The scale of the consequences differs. This is why the most important conflict management skill is not communication technique or negotiation strategy. It is physiological regulation, the ability to keep your own nervous system out of full threat activation long enough for your prefrontal cortex to remain online and generate responses that actually serve your goals. The argument is escalating. Your chest is tight. Your voice is rising. Your thinking is narrowing to the immediate exchange and losing sight of everything else that matters. This is the moment to name what is happening physiologically rather than continuing to respond to content. I need a moment. I am not thinking clearly right now, and I do not want to say something I cannot take back. When you feel the lid beginning to flip, your first instruction to yourself is regulate first, respond second. The conversation will still be there when my brain is back online. What does it feel like in your body in the moments just before you say something in a conflict that you later deeply regret? And what would change if you learned to read that physical signal as a stop sign rather than a starting gun?
Chapter 8. The Third Story. Every conflict has at least 3 stories: your story, their story, and the third story, the one that a wise, fair, and fully informed observer would tell about what actually happened between you. The third story is not a compromise between your story and theirs. It is a different story entirely, one that contains the legitimate truth of both perspectives without being owned by either. Harvard negotiation researchers Roger Fisher and William Ury identified this concept in their foundational work on principled negotiation. The third story does not ask who is right. It asks what is actually happening between these two parties. What are each of their real needs, fears, and constraints, and what resolution would genuinely serve both? In the Hormuz situation, the third story contains Iran's legitimate security concerns about American military presence in their regional waters, the U.S.'s legitimate concerns about freedom of navigation and regional stability, and the structural incentives on both sides that make escalation domestically useful even when it is strategically dangerous. The third story does not take sides. It makes the full picture visible. In your conflict, the third story contains your genuine hurt and the context that produced it. the other person's genuine perspective and the history they brought to the exchange, and the structural features of your relationship that made this particular conflict almost inevitable, regardless of either person's intentions. The third story makes you neither hero nor villain. It makes you human, and so does it make them. You have a serious conflict with a family member. Your story casts you as patient and reasonable. Their story casts them the same way. The third story says two people who both care about each other, both carrying old wounds from their shared history, both speaking from fear and translating it as anger, got caught in a pattern that neither of them designed and both of them maintain. When you are deep in your own story, try asking, what would the third story about this conflict say? The one that is fair to both of us without being fully owned by either of us. If someone told the third story about your most significant current conflict, what would it reveal about your own contribution that your personal story leaves out?
Chapter 9. The concession that is not a concession. The most sophisticated move in any de-escalating conflict, the move that diplomats spend careers learning and most people never discover, is the ability to change your position without appearing to abandon it. It sounds like manipulation. It is actually the deepest form of conflict intelligence. When both parties are locked in a position, the barrier to resolution is rarely the substance of the disagreement. It is almost always the face cost of moving. The question is not, can we find a solution? Most conflicts have multiple workable solutions. The question is, can we find a solution that allows both parties to move toward it without either of them having to call it a retreat? Skilled diplomats call this constructing a golden bridge, building a path for the other side to retreat along that allows them to reframe the retreat as something other than retreat. You are not giving them a way out, you are giving them a way forward that preserves their dignity. And in doing so, you are also preserving the relationship that will have to survive whatever resolution you reach. A potential golden bridge in the Hormuz situation might look like both sides agreeing to a multilateral navigation framework, not because either side backed down from their position, but because both sides can present the framework to their domestic audiences as a strategic achievement rather than a concession. The substance moves, the face is preserved, the latter comes down. You need to resolve a conflict with a colleague where both of you have said things that would make a direct apology feel humiliating. Rather than a direct apology, you say, I think we both care about this project too much to let this keep affecting it. Can we agree to start from here? You have not admitted fault. You have not demanded their admission. You have constructed a golden bridge that both of you can walk across. When resolution feels impossible because of face costs, ask, what framing would allow both of us to move toward resolution without either of us having to call it a retreat? Think about a conflict that ended badly, not because a solution was unavailable, but because neither party could find a way to move toward it without losing face. What golden bridge might have changed the outcome?
Chapter 10. The conflict you are choosing.
Here is the most uncomfortable truth this video has been building toward, and it applies to nations as much as it applies to you. Every unresolved conflict that persists beyond its natural resolution point is a conflict that at least one party is choosing to continue. Not consciously, not maliciously, but choosing nonetheless, because the conflict is serving a function that peace would not. Conflicts serve functions. They provide a sense of moral clarity. While the conflict continues, you know who the good party is and who the bad party is.
They provide a focus for identity. The conflict gives shape and purpose and a clear opposition. They provide a protection from vulnerability. As long as you are in conflict, you do not have to face whatever the relationship would require of you if the conflict resolved. For some governments, an external conflict simplifies domestic complexity. For some people, an unresolved conflict with a family member protects them from having to decide what they actually want the relationship to be. For some individuals, the ongoing Cold War with a former friend is preferable to the terrifying openness of either genuine reconciliation or genuine closure. Peace requires more courage than conflict. Conflict gives you a wall to push against. Peace requires you to stand in open ground and figure out who you are and what you want without an enemy to define you by opposition. This does not mean every conflict should be resolved. Some conflicts represent genuine incompatibilities of values or interests that no golden bridge can span. But it means that before you invest another day of your life in a conflict that is draining you, the most honest question you can ask is not what will it take to win. It is, what is this conflict giving me that I am afraid I would lose if it ended? The answer to that question, honest and undefended, will tell you more about what is actually happening than any analysis of who was right. Knowledge without practice is just commentary on other people's conflicts. So here is your single entry point for this week. Pick one unresolved conflict in your life, not the biggest one, not the most emotionally loaded one, a real one. Something where the cold distance has gone on longer than the original issue warranted. And ask yourself the third story question. Not your story, not their story, the third story, the one that is fair to both of you without being owned by either of you. Write it down if you can. 2 or 3 sentences describing what actually happened between two people who both had legitimate perspectives and both contributed to a pattern neither of them fully intended. Then read what you wrote and notice what it reveals about the smallest possible move you could make. Not the full resolution, not the comprehensive repair, just the smallest genuine gesture that would be consistent with the third story being true. That is your practice for this week. 1 third story, 1 small gesture, nothing more. The Strait of Hormuz will be resolved or it will not based on forces far beyond any individual's control. But the strait in your own life, the narrow passage between you and someone you used to be closer to, the channel that has been partially closed by a conflict neither of you fully chose, that one is entirely within your reach. The person who goes first does not lose. They just cared more about where they were going than about who was watching them get there. And in every conflict that ever mattered, in the history of nations and in the history of ordinary lives, that person was always the most powerful one in the room. If this made you think about a conflict differently, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Inner Logic, new psychology every week.